we'll get started. Thanks for coming. It's a small group, but a small group often means a lot of interactivity. So a good opportunity to ask some questions. Just introduce myself to you. I'm Dr. Lara Roeske. I'm a GP and practice owner back in Melbourne with over 20 years in general practice. But importantly, I'm a working party member and co-author of the new national guidelines. I chair the National Sexual Health Medicine Network of the RACGP. I've worked for over almost 15 years at VCS supporting the National Cervical Screening Programs, both previous and this, and I'm an associate investigator on Australia's largest clinical trial, which is operating as the independent data and safety monitoring trial for the renewed program known as COMPASS. So that's the background. We'll go straight into our new guidelines and just remind us that we're into our 10th month now with implementing this program. And of course, you know that the guidelines are available on a wiki-based platform that's interactive, but in those folders we do have a booklet which has a short summary of most of the guidelines that are relevant to clinical general practice. So please take that with you. So where are we now currently in Australia? Well, we're actually a world leader in cervical cancer prevention. In the early 2000s, we had the lowest mortality in the world. In 2007, we were the first country to implement a national HPV-based vaccination program. We have the largest cohort of HPV-vaccinated women anywhere in the world, and we've already demonstrated and published significant reduction in HPV prevalence at the cervix in young sexually active women, notably women aged 18 to 24. And we're sitting at about a less than 1.5% prevalence of 16 and 18 at the cervices of young sexually active women. And that is actually one of the reasons why we need this new program. We're the second country in the world to implement a HPV-based screening program. We've achieved extraordinary coverage with our 3-dose HPV vaccination program. 80% coverage for the third dose, so 3 doses complete for girls, and at 75.9% coverage for young boys. We're currently conducting in general practice Australia's largest clinical trial, COMPASS, and have recruited almost 75,000 women, and we welcome your interest and participation in that. You can complete an expression of interest if you'd like to be involved. We're set to eliminate cervical cancer in Australia by 2018, and will be the first country to do so, and none of this would happen without GPs, so we're critical to the success of implementing this program as we have been in the success of the previous program. So today we're going to be pretty action-packed, work through things pretty quickly. Just a quick overview of the new program. I just want to focus on risk assignment, a couple of tips for taking high-quality cervical samples where things might go wrong. We'll quickly look at how we should be applying the co-test according to guidelines, when it's okay to do a CST in a woman under 25. We might have some time to practice ordering tests and applying correct terminology in line with new guidelines, some comments on follow-up screening post-hysterectomy, how to access and activate that self-collection pathway. And there are 2 expressions of interest, one for COMPASS and one for a self-collection clinical audit for 40 points if you'd like, and that also accredited with ACRIM and for women's health points. So just very quickly, our program is for HPV vaccinated and unvaccinated, asymptomatic women aged 25 to 74 who are sexually active. Makes provision for the investigation of abnormal vaginal bleeding and includes a self-collection pathway. This new program is going to provide incredible reassurance and is great news for women. It's going to deliver a more effective screening program, looking for the causal agent, reducing screening episodes from 26 to 10 per woman lifetime, delivering a 24 to 36% reduction in cervical cancer incidence and mortality, and protecting up to 30% more women. So really you should be telling women the good news and reassuring them. Main features you're all aware of. We're starting later at 25. We're screening every 5 years. We have an exit test for asymptomatic women who've been regularly screened to 69. These women should be offered a one-off HPV test between the ages of 70 to 74. We're testing for 14 oncogenic HPV types, and where oncogenic HPV is detected, women will have reflex cytology. Reflex really refers to it will happen automatically on the sample that you've sent in, so you don't need to order the additional test. There is provision for a CST to be offered between the ages of 20 to 24 in women who disclose early exposure, early onset of sexual activity, defined in the guidelines as prior to the age of 14 and prior to HPV vaccination. Now that one-off CST will be funded between 20 to 24. It doesn't confer a benefit in terms of reducing incidence and mortality. It's been put there simply for psychological relief, basically. Of course, what's new is that the guidelines have been pretty strong to say you can screen any time during pregnancy. I think most of us aren't going to get heavily pregnant women up in the second and third trimester. If you are going to screen at any time during pregnancy, you will not be using a combi brush and you will not be using an endocervical brush. So the recommendation is to screen if women are due or overdue during pregnancy. And of course, for immune deficient, which replaces the word immune compromised or immunosuppressed, immune deficient is the new term, there is actually no validated clinical tool for any GP to use in this country to assess what that actually means. I'd just like to make that point. My job was to find one. I couldn't, nor in the world. So we're left as usual to our own devices and conclusions, but obviously women who are HIV positive organ transplant recipients, women who are on azathioprine or a number of immunosuppressants with long-term immune suppressing conditions, and that can be rheumatoid arthritis or SLE. We see a lot of that in practice, including Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. So these women will be eligible for a 3-year turnaround, and that's in line with the WHO. So you would just order a CST, note that they're immune deficient, and you should receive a recommendation for a rescreen in 3 years rather than 5. So just to tell you, this test is actually a nucleic acid test. It can be a PCR for either DNA or RNA. In most labs it is for DNA. I've mentioned the reflex liquid-based cytology. Some people aren't understanding that it's happening reflexively when oncogenic HPV is detected. By the way, 94% of CSTs are negative. So that leaves only about 6% in which we're going to detect any oncogenic HPV, just so that you're aware. Some key principles that we should all remember: that HPV is the most significant infectious cause of cancer. And in this country, 93% of cervical cancer is due to HPV. There was a recent study that looked at 850 cervical cancers and typed them. 77% were due to 16 and 18, and a further 16% were due to 31, 33, 45, 52 and 58. And of course, they're the additional 5 that are included in the new 9-valent vaccine. The heavy lifting of vaccination occurs with Gardasil. There is no need to revaccinate if people have been vaccinated with Gardasil. There is an incremental additional benefit. I just wanted to make those points. So most of the LSILs we see are really manifestations of acute HPV infection. 78% of those clear at 12 months, 98% at 24 months. So clearance is the most likely outcome. In fact, it's only about 5 to 10% of HPV infections that will persist and then over at least 10 years turn into a persistent infection. Most of the cancer, 50% of the HPV infections that lead to cancer actually occur before the age of 20. And that's why vaccination is so important, and a further 70%, 75% up to the age of 30. And pre-cancer, which is CIN3, effectively, really at a molecular level means absence of clearance or persistence. So that resource card is in your folders. It can be used to explain screening and the pathway to women. I'm putting up Dilna. Hi, welcome. We're just doing a very quick, because we've had a late start. Dilna's curve, Dilna's meta-analysis was published in the BMJ. I just want to focus on this very, very quickly because these messages are very important about why it's safe to wait 5 years. So Dilna looked at hundreds of thousands of women and looked at what happened if you were HPV negative in the red line at baseline as a screening test versus a pap smear negative in the blue line versus HPV and a pap test, or cytology, which is effectively a co-test at baseline. Followed hundreds of thousands of women out for 6 years to really try and see how many of them develop precancer of the cervix after one negative screening round. And what was found is that if you screen 1,000 women at time 0 with a pap smear, then 4 out of 1,000 at 2 years will have precancer. And in fact, 3 out of 1,000 of those women will have precancer at 3 years, which is the screening interval that's quite accepted in a number of other countries around cytology. However, if you screen 1,000 women with an HPV test in the red line at baseline and you wait 6 years, only 2 out of those 1,000 women will have cervical precancer. So this test is outperforming pap smears all the way out to the 2-year mark. So when women say to you, well, you know, is 5 years okay? Actually, they are much better off at every single point with this new HPV test. And I just want to bring that point home to you. One last graph here is understanding risk assessment, because for the first time in this new program, women are receiving an individualised risk assessment on the laboratory report. And this meta-analysis published by Khan actually shows in 2005, looks at women who start off HPV positive, follows them over 10 years and works out what is their risk of developing cervical precancer. And what we find here is that if women start off with HPV 16, they are at the highest risk of developing precancer. And in fact, we quantify that at 17% over 10 years will develop CIN3 or worse. For 18, 11% will develop. But for the other 12 oncogenic types, which we're testing for, the risk is about 3%. So in our new cervical screening program, we actually allocate higher risk to 16 and 18. 16 being by far the most oncogenic, the type that's least likely to clear, most likely to spread, and most likely to persist, followed by 18. Importantly, adenocarcinoma, which arises from the endocervical canal, from the glandular cells of the canal of the cervix. This is not an endometrial or a uterine cancer, it's a cancer of the cervix, has been a real problem for us. When we started screening with a national program in '93, we were unable to make an impact for the next few decades on the incidence and mortality of this cancer. It started out representing about 15 to 25% of all cervical cancer back in the early 90s. 5 to 10% of all cervical cancer. It now represents almost a quarter of all cervical cancer. And the cause of adenocarcinoma is infection with HPV, persistent infection with oncogenic HPV, particularly type 18, and then type 16 and the other types. And that's a very important point to remember for a couple of reasons, which I'll talk to, but particularly because this new HPV-based screening program is poised to reduce incidence and mortality from adenocarcinoma, and for the first time make an impact on this cancer, which actually peaks in the 40s, is harder to detect, harder to reach, harder to evaluate colposcopically, and for those reasons is often much more advanced when it is detected. So please remember that adenocarcinoma is proportionately now more common. It is also caused by HPV. So when you get a CST result that is 18 positive and reflex cytology negative, that is a flag for the colposcopist to do an endocervical evaluation of the canal and look for that glandular lesion that may be there. Intermediate risk and low risk. So our overall risk assessment that the lab will give you doesn't just take into account the CST result and any reflex liquid-based cytology. It also takes into account the cervical screening history of the woman and what you've written to give you either a low risk, come back in 5 years, higher risk, refer for colp, or intermediate risk with a follow-up HPV at 12 months. Now, what you might have already discovered is some women come back with a negative result all through here and a higher risk assignment. Why is that? That is because there may well be a high-grade lesion on a previous PAP that hasn't been resolved and seen to with a test of cure protocol, or it may be because you've provided some clinical notes that are relevant. So just be aware of that. Very quickly now, we're just going to summarise those concepts. In the new program then, the HPV test is actually a test of risk. the reflex cytology or liquid-based cytology is a triage test. And the colposcopy and biopsy are the tests of disease. Now, co-testing are in fact diagnostic tests or surveillance tests or used as a test of cure. So, you've got some sampling devices. I want you to quickly look at them. We're just going to go through some basic principles. So let's take off the wrapping on our thin prep vial, and we're going to do something which none of you probably do, which is check the expiry date. So we're doing gold standard cervical sampling practice right now. So please look at your expiry date. You'll note that legally, actually, it should be providing 3 identifiers on this: a first name, a last name, and a date of birth. So just a last name and a date of birth isn't technically sufficient. You'll also note there are 2 black marks on the lid and the body of the vial. Those need to oppose or cross each other so there is no loss of cellular material or leakage during transport. Now, when you are selecting your sampling instruments, and before you do, think about lubricant. So in this new screening program, great news, we're going to see a lot less unsatisfactories. When they do occur, in 90% of cases, it's because there's insufficient cellular material in here. One of the big problems is we are not transferring enough cellular material from the cervix into this vial. So we'll talk to how we make sure we do that in a moment. And the other 10% are due to inappropriate use of lubricant. So lubricants become an issue. It needs to be water soluble and carbon free. A lot of the companies now have come on board to ensure that those things are met, and that's because that lubricant can interfere with the quality of the sample and also the filter, the HPV filter, the reading of results. So when you're selecting your instruments, you will select them according to the age and the reproductive and physiological status of the woman. So postmenopausal women should generally have an endocervical brush or an extended tip added to when you're taking the sample so that you reach that endocervical component. We're still visualising a cervix, we're still inserting a speculum, we're still trying to get some endocervical component in there if we can, except for self-collection, which we'll talk about. So most premenopausal women, you can get away with the cervix broom or the spatula, which I'm still stuck with, and that's fine, that's what I grew up with. With pregnant women, we said we're not going to be using either of these. So for a premenopausal woman, you want to, and you can make your own little cervix. This is a smiley cervix, so it's a multip. She's delivered a few babies through there. When you apply this cervix broom, you want to apply it firmly to the surface of the cervix so that it actually fans out, and you take it through 3 rotations. So those bristles should be fanning through those 3 rotations, and then you're actually picking up 300,000 odd cells. Now you can actually place that in the vial like that and leave it there. Say she's now postmenopausal and you're going to add the endocervical brush. And you may routinely do this for all women, and that's absolutely fine. The endocervical brush doesn't need to go all the way up into the canal. It needs to be inserted so that you can see the bottom third, and it only needs to be turned a third, 12 to 3 o'clock. That is sufficient to pick up hundreds of thousands of cells, so there's no need to go around like this. You can now actually add that to the other brush and deal with both of them together in this vial. This is where we have the MasterChef part of the cooking demonstration, which none of you are doing because you're so excited that you've got no more slides and fixative. You're going like this and chucking this out. That's not going to release cellular material into this liquid base. So we need you to actually push hard down against the bottom and the sides of the vial and rotate through about 10 rotations. That will give us a maximal sample. These should always be discarded when you're using thin prep, thrown away, and then sealed so that the black dots oppose. I've brought BD Pathology along. I don't receive any money from any of these companies, but BD Pathology is the only other platform that is appropriate and validated for this screening program. 1 in 10 GPs use it. The difference with a BD Path is it has a provision to actually allow you to snap off the end of the brush and leave it in there, okay? So once they sort it out, because at the moment to get that in there you have to snip that off, and to get this left in there you have to break it off. Once they make it a lot less fiddlier, I'd be taking out maybe some stocks and shares in this, because where we use it in Compass at the moment in the trial is when we get an unsatisfactory, a run of unsatisfactory, say with a practitioner, we'll send this out, they'll leave us the brush in here, we will spin that down and centrifuge it, and we'll have a great pellet, quite concentrated, and we'll often be able to prevent a woman having to come in for a third time or a second time. So that's BD shortcuts, so you know a little bit about that. So moving right along, when to order the co-test. This is when you're allowed to order a co-test, when you're investigating symptoms, when you're needing to follow up a test of cure after hysterectomy, and in DES exposed women. I want to talk to clinical judgment. Why I love this part of the guidelines is it's going to make us the best doctors we can be, because we need to apply our clinical judgment when we're ordering a co-test. So, co-test for the investigation of symptoms that are likely to indicate the presence of cancer of the cervix. Abnormal bleeding or vaginal bleeding is the symptom most likely. That is broken down into postmenopausal bleeding, intermenstrual bleeding, and postcoital bleeding. Postmenopausal bleeding should always be investigated with a co-test. The guidelines will tell you that even if the cervix is clinically normal and the co-test is negative, these women should be referred on further for gynecological assessment. And I don't know how easy that is necessarily, where you are and where you're placed. For intermenstrual bleeding and postcoital bleeding, the key words and concepts are unexplained, or first episode, persistent, or recurrent. So if you can apply any of those scenarios to a woman with those symptoms, then you should be using a co-test. But you should be ordering a co-test. So if a young woman comes in at 24, under 25, and she's got postcoital bleeding, you have some choices. You can actually decide you're going to do a chlamydia test outright, and perhaps see if that comes back as something or not. And if it doesn't, then you might decide you want to order a co-test. And it's fine, it's an unexplained first episode. The likelihood of her having cancer of the cervix is extremely low. And that's where you might actually decide to do a chlamydia test, tell her if the bleeding comes back. You want to know if it doesn't, she'll be due for a CST next year at 25, and she'll receive a reminder at 24 and 9 months. So you can use your judgment there. If, however, a woman does present with either postcoital or intermenstrual bleeding and it doesn't go away, or it in fact recurs after a period of time, then you should be ordering a co-test, and it doesn't matter when the last CST was. For vaginal discharge and for dyspareunia, both of these are unlikely associations with the true presence of cervical cancer. They're usually associated with a host of benign gynecological or sexually transmissible infections, and you should be going down that pathway first. Having said that, any discharge that is blood-stained or offensive, any dyspareunia that is persistent or unusual should be investigated with a co-test. So you may have labs that are quite friendly, that are quite happy to do anything, and then send patient bills. That is not right. Okay? What you should be doing is applying your clinical judgment according to the guidelines and using this co-test judiciously. And we work very hard in Victoria and South Australia to support our practitioners, disarming this, I guess, in the appropriate clinical context in line with the guidelines. So I'll move on from that, and happy to stay around and take some questions. This has not changed. From 2005 onwards, our guidelines back then said any woman who's ever had a biopsy-proven high-grade lesion should be given 2 tests, a cytology and an HPV, and return 12 months later for the same again, cytology and HPV. A cytology and HPV are now known as co-tests. So again, in these guidelines, we have a test of cure protocol which returns women at high risk back to population risk. Population risk for cervical screening is 5 yearly. Any woman who's had a biopsy-proven high-grade lesion is not at population risk and can't be returned safely to a 5-yearly screening program until she has completed 2 consecutive co-tests, preferably no longer than 12 months apart, or you have to start again. All right? The earliest you should be ordering a co-test is not earlier than 10 to 11 months after a biopsy-proven high-grade lesion. A lot of our gynaes are inappropriately ordering it when they re-look at them after they've had a colposcopy and treatment. It's too early. The whole point of this is to wait for the woman to clear the HPV infection. Yes?
So it has to be two a year apart?
Yeah. It has to be a co-test, which is really, you just prepare one sample.
Yeah.
You will write co-test, TOC, test of cure.
If she misses the second one a year apart,
this screening, I think it's worth the investment, because what I say to them is I'm trying to return you back to a 5-year interval now. Yeah.
But
Ideally.
I think two clear screens is important.
2 clear screens, preferably by 12 months. If it's been 2 years, then you just wear that decision and make a note. Yeah, absolutely, and discuss it with the woman. Now, very quickly with hysterectomies, page 189 of the guidelines, lots of confusion around post-hysterectomy. So this is how you break it down. Firstly, you want to know what was the prior screening history of the woman. It actually will inform what you're going to do. That can be hard to know. Secondly, you want to know what the hyster was for. Was it for a benign or a malignant reason? And that can be hard to know. And the third is, what was the cervical histopathology at the time of the hyster? So I tend to get the points 2 and 3 from the op note. So I'll just ring wherever it was done and say, I want you to send me the biopsy and the operative notes. Because on there it'll give me indication. It'll also tell me if the ovaries are there or not. I need to actually know that as well. And it'll give me some biopsy results. The reason why you want to know those 3 things is that a woman with a prior screening history that's fine, with benign reason for hyster and no abnormality, cervical pathology, doesn't need anything. And that's great. Conversely, anyone who's had a previous adenocarcinoma in situ, either as excised prior to the hyster or as a reason for the hyster, or found at cervical pathology at the time of the hyster, needs a test of cure indefinitely until the guidelines say something different, which is co-testing every year. Indefinitely. All right? So there are a number of permutations here. Anywhere.
Sorry, can you just repeat that? I just want to make sure I heard it right. Do that second one.
The second one. So adenocarcinoma in situ, whether it be in the cervical screening history of the woman, whether it be the reason for the hyster, whether it be discovered at the time of the hyster on the cervical histopathology, requires annual co-testing indefinitely until further research informs the change. Yeah, okay. Just remembering this, if at any point a HSIL creeps up and it hasn't been resolved with a test of cure, that's what you would do. You would actually do, and this is an example here, so it's maybe a previous treatment or no treatment for a test of cure, benign, and perhaps they've got unexpected positive margins for HSIL at the time. They just get the co-test and 12 months later the co-test again, and then no further follow-up. Now, to actually maximise the sample, don't limit yourself to the very lower vaginal. We want a high volt, vaginal volt sample sent in. How am I going for time? Okay. All right, some questions for you. Let's warm up a bit before we do self-collection. She's 38, she doesn't have symptoms, she's received a reminder to return for screening, her previous pap test was negative. What are you going to order? CST, it's easy, yep. 41-year-old asymptomatic, we follow her up 12 months after a previous CST result. This is the result. She's had other oncogenic HPV, not 16 detected, and reflex cytology, which showed a low-grade abnormality. What test are you going to order at 12 months? Yeah, that's very good. So we have seen confusion around this intermediate arm where you're receiving results around other oncogenic HPV type detected. That means we found one of 12 other types, not 16 or 18. Remember I said to you, the risk of pre-cancer over 10 years is 3% in these women. In the new program, we're triaging them with the reflex cytology. So they can move up to high risk if their reflex cytology result here was actually HSIL or possible HSIL or glandular abnormality. The recommendation would be go to COB and they would be receiving a high risk assignment. However, if the reflex cytology is negative, possible low grade or low grade, for this group, they will stay in intermediate risk and will be asked to come back and you order a follow-up HPV test at 12 months looking for clearance. And if the clearance is there, they go to 5 years. 55-year-old, postmenopausal, 3 months of intermittent vaginal bleeding. What are you going to order? Yep, the co-test and also a referral to a gynae. 24, single episode of postcoital bleeding, a clinically normal cervix. What test are you going to order? You can go a few ways here. You could do a CST, but you could not do a CST, you could do a chlamydia and do nothing right now, but you could do a co-test, and you should think about a chlamydia test, definitely. 34, asymptomatic, 12 months after treatment for a biopsy-proven high-grade lesion. What are you going to order there? Co-test. Yep, so this is part of the test of cure pathway. That's exactly right. Okay, so some messages. Under 25, there are 3 occasions in which you can order a CST and it will be funded. Remember we said about early onset sexual activity, so if it was under 14 and prior to HPV vaccination, between 20 and 24 you can order a one-off CST and it will be funded. The other 2 are when the woman actually has, say, symptoms that you think are likely to indicate the presence of cervical cancer, you'll be ordering a co-test there. And the third is if they've actually been screened under the previous 2-year program and they've been found to have an abnormality, either a low grade or a high grade, these women should be followed up at the next recommended time. If they were negative in the previous program, unfortunately, I think, I don't know, the government and everyone else forget that we have our own recall systems in general practice. We will have recalled these women in for 2-year screening. Say they were screened at 20 with a negative, they're coming in at 22, and in fact, they're not eligible. So for those women, you're going to be focusing on your chlamydia testing. By the way, gonorrhea is now an epidemic in heterosexual women in this country. On this thin prep vial with our lab, you can do HPV genotyping for HPV, cytology, chlamydia, gonorrhea, mycoplasma. We're also now validating for trichomonas, bacterial vaginosis, and candidiasis. So that'll be nice when that's all on offer. But for these young women too, of course, access to emergency medicine, principles around safe sex, are they confident in buying and using condoms, how do they negotiate around that? So there's a lot you can still do with your younger woman that comes in who's not eligible. So a couple of cases. She's 22, she presents to your practice, her last pap smear was 12 months ago, it was negative with a recommendation to return in 2 years. What is the next step in managing? She should have a CST as recommended, she should be advised that she doesn't need to return, she should be offered chlamydia and advised not to come until 25. Absolutely. I didn't make it. 21, presents with 4 months of postcoital bleeding. You tell her she only needs chlamydia screening as this is the most likely cause. She should have a co-test as well as appropriate STI test. She doesn't need a CST. B, absolutely. Yep. Last one, I think, or second last. 38-year-old patient had an L-cell on her pap smear 12 months ago, so now we're older than 25. She needs a CST now if negative. She should rescreen in 5 years. She should have a co-test to confirm the abnormal cellular changes have resolved. She should have a CST now if negative. She should return in 12 months for a repeat. We tried to make this tricky. But BC, A. So L-cell. L-cell, 78% of them clear, 98%, 12 months, 98% will at 2 years. It's not a high-grade lesion. It doesn't qualify for a co-test. She just needs to come in, have a CST. If she's got no evidence of oncogenic HPV, she's probably cleared what may have been causing it, or she had another non-oncogenic HPV type causing that L-cell, and she can come back safely in 5 years. And a 55-year-old treated for a biopsy-proven high-grade 2 years ago. She attended last year and had a co-test. Both tests were negative last year. What follow-up do you recommend for this patient? She's cleared her HPV, so she needs a repeat CST in 4 years' time. She should have a further co-test. If both tests are negative, she can return in 5 years. She needs an HPV test now. If negative, she's safe to come back. What do you think? She needs the co-test, that's right, to complete the test of cure. Excellent. I will go over that and just go to this one. 45-year-old cone biopsy for adenocarcinoma in situ 5 years ago, but annual pap smears have been normal since then. Your management includes continuing annual cytology, as AIS is not related to HPV, that is very false. A co-test now, and in 12 months, if both are negative, she can go to 5 yearly. She requires annual co-testing for life. See, we talked about that. Excellent. So, self-collection. Though we've got lots of good news about how we're going here in Australia generally, when it comes to being world leaders, 4 out of 10 women in this country do not participate in cervical screening at the recommended interval. So, and we've actually published that 80% of women with invasive cervical cancer in this country are either never screened or under-screened. So the self-collection pathway is really an MSAC-endorsed, evidence-based pathway aiming to increase participation, return these women to the cervical screening program. I do have to acknowledge that there are certain groups that are overrepresented in the under and never screened. And of course, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women particularly have a high incidence of cervical cancer and a much higher mortality. Also, women from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds and rural remote women. Having said that, there are lots of groups that we just miss. Notably, I hate to say, medical women who are busy with families and jobs. So older women, women who are just say, we've had this, I'm just too fat. I've been avoiding a pap smear for 23 years because I'm too fat. Women with disabilities, with addictions, women in prisons, women who identify as same-sex attracted, women who've experienced sexual violence and trauma, a big group, and women with a previous negative pap smear experience. So they are there in our practices. We were asked by the department to do some modelling work. We ran a number of self-collection pilots to create a service model to inform the new program. I haven't told you much about our organisation because I haven't had time. We're a huge not-for-profit, state and Commonwealth funded, and we write policy. We're also Australia's largest lab reading CSTs. We've read 12 million cycle screening tests actually since we've been around, which is since 1964. So a huge public health service entity. What was amazing about this self-collection pilot is that of the women who were eligible, who were offered this, and they were in clinics where there were some very disadvantaged women, 85.7% took it up, and more astonishingly, 91.6% completed follow-up, so they really engaged with self-collection. And I mean, that quote, so much easier, it takes all the fear out of it, like you're not going to hurt yourself, you know, etc. So that's very powerful messaging. So what do you need to do? You've got your self-collection kits there that you can take back with you. So there is no excuse. I don't care what the politicians are telling you, what your lab is telling you, because your lab doesn't care about this, because they can't make any money. They can't process it right now. There is only one lab that can process it in the country. It is VCS, and that's simply because we're not a normal lab. So that is why. The other labs are trying very hard to validate the test. In the meantime, we will waive all fees for postage. We validated this test for heat, humidity, for delays. We are into over 1,000 now that we have read and reported. We're accepting from the Kimberley, from remote Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, from West Australia, you name it. We're in Victoria. So, women need to be eligible. They need to be 30 or older. They need to be at least 2 years overdue for screening. So in a 2-year based screening program, you're not 2 years overdue until it's been 4 years. So it needs to be 4 years since their last pap smear. It doesn't matter what the result on the last pap smear was, okay? At a minimum. And once we've got enough time passed, it'll be 7 years in the new program, which is a 5-year program. So 2 years overdue is 7 years. They should not be pregnant, and women who've had a hyster are not eligible, preferably not during the time of a period as well. You should offer them the conventional clinician-collected option, and they decline it, and that's something I would document, just decline speculum. Women decline for a whole lot of reasons. You don't have to, it doesn't matter why. It's whatever reason. So then you can say to them, and I would do this, I'm just going to jump down and grab a swab. I believe I don't have one up there. Let's say, well, that's okay, because we now have an option for you, and I can offer you the option of taking your own sample. So on my desk, I usually have this. I say, I'd like to show you the swab. In a moment, I'm going to give you a private place to take the sample. Women don't need to go to the toilet. They're not passing urine or doing a fecal sample. Most women can do this behind the screen. And actually, just if you've got a footstool, I do for my bed, you can get the woman to put her foot up or just squat lightly. She'll need to take her underwear away, obviously, like putting in a tampon. Here's the swab. It's a soft tip. It needs to be inserted into the vagina. Please note there's a red mark on the swab. For your information, it's at the 8 centimetre mark. We tell women we don't want them to put the swab in past that point. So they might want to hold it there when they put it in. It doesn't matter if it's low, mid or high vaginal. They are both equally accurate and effective. So for women, they just have to pop the swab in, tell them, turn it a couple of times, 1 to 3 times, take it out, put it back in the tube, and give that back to the nurse or the doctor. You will then put this in a specimen bag. We've got 5 request forms, 5 swabs. On the request form, you tick through the printer, CST, this is a bona fide cervical screening test. You don't have to think of any other words to describe this, vagina, whatever. CST, this is what it is. Sign it. You will add VCS Pathology, reply paid, PO Box 178, Carlton, Victoria, onto the front of your envelope, plain envelope, and get someone to put it in the post box. And we will provide you with a result. The only thing that you do need to do is there's a web address. You need to log on to VCS and just provide your practice detail and your provider detail so we can legally give you a result. Results will come to you electronically or hard copy or both. You will actually tick what you'd like. Yes?
So will other labs forward it on to you?
Yes. You can ask other labs too. Some of them can be a bit difficult about it and some will. Okay?
Usually they just lose our stuff. So.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's your choice. Yes, absolutely.
So it can't be cytology, it's just...
No, so this is a very good point. So this is a vaginal cell sample. So with women who test negative for this, these women will come back in 5 years. If they come back in 5 years and they again refuse a speculum, it will be funded for them to have another self-collect in 5 years. For the women in which we detect 16 and 18, you will tell them you need to come back and I'll organise a referral for colposcopy. At the time of colp, they will have the cytology done that will inform the colposcopist. It is the small percentage, 2 to 3%, who have oncogenic non-16-18 infection. So 31, 33, 30, the list goes on, 12 types, not 16 or 18, that will need to come back to you to have a sample taken from the cervix. So I tell them a very small number of you will need to come back here. It's only just a couple of you that might need to. Most of you are going to get a negative result and a lot of reassurance that I can say to you confidently you're not at risk of getting a problem in your cervix or cancer in the cervix for the next 5 years when I see you. So that's great. But a small number need to come in and I will need to take a sample from the cervix because that will tell me what your next step is in management. If we find that you have very minor cell changes or no cell changes on that cervix, you come back in 12 months. If we find that you have some more serious cell changes, I need to refer you to a specialist. So that's the caveat with this pathway. Yeah.
And if they come back in 12 months?
Yeah. Then you can repeat this.
Okay.
Yeah, for the HPV. So just very quickly, I am finishing up now. This swab is very important. You can't send us a red, orange top nasopharyngeal swab, okay? Why? Because the way the cotton is wound around the swab is to increase and maximise the surface area to pick up as much HPV as we can. Now, what that does is give it an accuracy, sensitivity, specificity of 98%, which is no different to a practitioner-collected sample. In fact, we believe this will be the screening test of the future. 3 self-collects at 30, 40 and 50. We're getting there. So remember, that's why we're supplying you with these and you can order them. They're Copan 552C. So someone in the practice needs to check the label to make sure. Tell women, by the way, we've tested it for this. It's okay if they touch the end of it or they drop it on a dry surface or it's forgotten and found in the toilet, patient toilet 3 weeks later. It can all still be read and be sent to us, okay? And just, we talked about follow-up. Just quickly, if she's 50, she's asymptomatic, she declines a speculum, her last pap test was 7 years ago, what are you going to order? You're going to order a CSTD, you're going to send us a swab. Now, some women will say, I don't want to do this myself, can you do it? Don't write that on the form. Okay, if you send a red top swab and a CST, we know what to do. The TTA will not allow us to process anything that isn't self-collect. So some women do need assistance, even for this. They just don't want the speculum, but they're happy for you to do that. The other thing is it says in the clinic setting. Remember, we go out to nursing homes and we go on home visits where there are women who are eligible. That is a bona fide place to be doing this. It's not a mail-out kit. It's not to go to the pathology lab and have it done in the collection centre. And very finally, so GPs anywhere in Australia can do this. That's our challenge. Here we are. We operate a toll-free 1-800 number, and that number or email is available to you for any clinical queries. So thank you for your time. I'll stay for some questions. Yes, you would like to say something, Joan? No?
I'd like you.
No.
Is anyone here for the supervisory relationship?
Thanks, Jess.
Hey, I'm just going to ask.
Yes, I am.
Do you hear that?
Is anyone else here for this session?
Okay. So I was just checking if there wasn't anyone here for it, I was happy to let you go over.
Yeah, no, that's fine. We'll finish now.
Thank you.
Any quick questions, yes, just before I finish, about any aspect of the screening hopefully there'll be, it'll, more and more labs will be able to
Do
do
you think
this.
you have to wait 7 years though?
Well, you're safe at 5, so you're only waiting an extra 2 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm really happy to support Lara on routine awareness because I'm actually a cervical cancer screen test saved person. I was saved by a cervical cancer screen test back in the old 2-year program. So if anyone's got any questions,
I'd like to go up to the other session.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for your time. I will finish up because it's been a day that's run a little bit over time from the start of the day, I understand. And I'll be outside to answer questions. I should have mentioned Jess, who's one of our scientists from the lab. She's been providing support down at the stand. So feel free to come down and see me at the stand if you've got questions. I'll finish now. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.